vaccine hesitancy, Tuskegee's threat to global health, vaccination.
Hello guys, as you probably may know, COVID vaccines are finally coming, and as a result of vaccines being a trending topic, anti-vax narratives are also spreading across the internet more frequently, which is unfortunate but also expected. And I want to address one that people are, understandably so, a bit hesitant to address, which is the prevalence of anti-vax sentiment among African Americans. According to a recent poll by the Pew Research Center, only 42% of African Americans will get the COVID vaccine, which is a much lower percentage in comparison to other ethnic groups in the United States. Now, a couple of people have been trying to explain this phenomenon on social media and on progressive media. I saw a couple of articles about it on the New York Times and the Washington Post. And to my disappointment, it seemed that to most progressives, this rampant anti-vax sentiment among African Americans is justifiable and reasonable. But the truth is, if we're going to take the route of argumentation that these articles take as justification for mistrust in vaccines, like mentioning horrible cases of unethical research on African Americans, such as the infamous Tuskegee Experiment in Alabama, from which from 1932 to 1972, 600 impoverished African American men were used as guinea pigs by the Public Health Service and the CDC in a syphilis experiment.
The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro. The program began in the 1920s to document the devastating impact of syphilis. Syphilis was a dreaded disease. Symptoms included severe skin rashes, fever, and pain. To find out more about how the disease affects the body, the Public Health Service initiated a program in Macon County, Alabama, a rural farming community with a high incidence of syphilis. 600 men were recruited for the study. 400 had syphilis, 200 used as a control did not. Nearly all were poor farmers or sharecroppers. Initially, the men in the study received treatments, but with the stock market crash, funds were no longer available and treatments were terminated. However, researchers continued to collect data on the men in the expectation that funding for treatment would become available within 6 months. Ultimately, the 6 months of non-treatment would continue for 40 years. And throughout that period, the men were never told the whole truth.
If you're going to use examples like these to make the claim that African Americans have good reasons to don't trust vaccines, then everybody of all demographics have reasons to be anti-vaccines on the same ground. Because medicine has a long history of unethical experimentation, not only on African Americans and not only in the United States. Notorious examples of that are the Project 4.1 by the US military, in which the effects of nuclear fallout were tested in the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands in 1954, the genetic experiments conducted in Havasupai people by the Arizona State University in 1989, and numerous other unethical experiments conducted on Native Americans across the years, the hepatitis experiment on 50 disabled children of the Willbrook State Hospital in New York, sponsored by the US military in the 1950s and 60s, the syphilis experiment on over 5,000 Guatemalans in the 1940s, also sponsored by the US government, and that followed a similar model to aforementioned Tuskegee experiment, the numerous experiments conducted by doctors of Nazi Germany in Jews, Polish, Romani, and pretty much every ethnicity in Europe, the infamous Unit 731 of the Japanese army that during World War II conducted horrible experiments on POWs and civilians of many Asian nations, the placebo HIV drug experiments done in Africa, sponsored by the US in the 1990s, which affected about 12,000 African women, experiments conducted on Aboriginal Australians by the Adelaide University in the 1920s and 30s, and many other examples. So history shows that not only African Americans have reasons to be anti-vax on these grounds, everybody does. Unfortunately, it's something that happened to almost pretty much every demographic. Now, I understand that in the United States, African Americans and Native Americans were affected by this more than most. American history is unfortunately embedded in racism. That's why ethnic minorities that have been historically seen as racially inferior by the majority ended up getting the worst of it. Not only in medical research, but in everything. I don't deny that, but I don't deny either that racism in this circumstance is only part of the problem, only one dimension of the horrors made in the name of medical science throughout history. There are other things that we must look into. It's not that difficult for agencies and organizations involved in medical research to get away with malpractice. For example, due to confidentiality issues, a lot of the information involved in these processes can be maintained private, and that can be abused. These institutions have a reputation to maintain, and whenever something wrong occurs, it's much better for them to cover up and solve it all internally instead of making the public aware of what happened and what measures are being taken. And when it comes to clinical trials, for example, watchdog organizations depend on the institutions sponsoring or conducting these experiments to release their reports to the public in order to investigate any misconduct. In 2018, for example, the UK House of Commons Science and Technology Committee issued a report noting that 50% of clinical trials done in the UK and the European Union were not reported. Fortunately, since 2018, the numbers in the European Union have increased. In the US, is about 72% of trials are reported, which is far from ideal, but it's not that terrible. In other parts of the world, however, like Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, it's a lot easier for these institutions to get away with malpractice because the governments there are a lot less effective in investigating any wrongdoings. And when we look at the cases of gross abuse, like when people were deliberately exposed to dangerous agents or viruses, there are three major trends that we can observe. The subjects are mostly members of ethnic minorities or foreigners. Research is conducted in prisons, and research is sponsored by the military. Now, those of you who follow me know that I really dislike identity politics and the so-called woke movement in the American intelligentsia. And for me, the biggest red flag about identity politics is how it has been so overwhelmingly embraced by large corporations and government institutions. If this was an ideology that really threatened the distribution of power of the status quo, powerful organizations would not embrace it. It baffles me that people who claim to be anti-status quo and anti-capitalism and uncritically adhere to identity politics don't realize that. And by focusing their attention almost exclusively on racial inequality, these institutions can make policy changes that affect their structures on a superficial level without compromising the foundations that allow them to act with impunity. Sure, trying to compensate for a history of racism is a good thing, is a positive thing, but that doesn't address the often corrupt relationship between medical research, criminal justice systems, and the military-industrial complex around the world. By focusing almost exclusively on racial disparities, the fact that medical research often takes advantage of people in extreme vulnerability, like poverty and incarceration, is largely ignored. People in such circumstances are much more likely to accept becoming guinea pigs when they are offered something in return. Using the Tuskegee experiment as example, the African American men who submitted themselves to that experiment were poor, and the reason why they accepted to be part of that experiment without raising many questions was because they were offered free healthcare.
Men who were poor and African American, without resources and with few alternatives, they believed they had found hope when they were offered free medical care.
The similar experiments done in Guatemala was mostly conducted in prisons and mental institutions.
They were using prisoners as basically their stock of observed subjects?
Right. They started off doing prisoners, and when not enough infection was created with the prostitutes, they moved on to actually giving the men syphilis itself. And because they needed a larger pool of subjects, they moved on to an army barracks and then to the National Insane Asylum.
In a 1973 article published in The Atlantic, a physician involved in clinical trials in prisons was quoted saying that using inmates for trials provide numerous benefits, including the fact that they are cheaper than chimpanzees. And by the way, it's a recurring argument among extreme animal rights advocates that we should stop doing experiments on animals and use inmates instead. Now, of course, in a society that has been historically racist, disadvantaged ethnic groups end up getting the worst of it. In the United States, the dehumanization of poor people and of inmates is something that affects African Americans in a larger proportion. But it doesn't affect African Americans exclusively, and that cannot be ignored. And it seems to me that in the current climate of identity politics, that is often the case. It's not uncommon to see progressives making generalizing statements about white people as a uniformly privileged class, and that is just not true. In another recent article on the New York Times about COVID vaccination, these college professors were discussing the ethics of the CDC vaccination program. And they were arguing whether teachers, the people who educate our children, often working under terrible conditions, should or should not be considered essential workers for vaccination. Two of them thought that they shouldn't because they are too white. Only one thought that teachers should be considered essential workers, but not because of the noble and essential nature of their job, but because vaccinating them would benefit their black and brown students. However, all of this should be disregarded because according to this good doctor, the same that was pandering to anti-vax narratives on Twitter, white people have no credibility, so we should just ignore them. Now this is not the way to deal with racial issues sensibly. To condone the notion that people of certain skin color have more or less credibility when providing healthcare, or that authorities should make a decision about who is priority to receive a vaccine based on the color of people's skin, isn't progress. It's racism. And that's why these college-educated idiots are failing miserably to address the anti-vax problem among African Americans, because they are choosing pandering to people with extreme views over facts and empathy. It's unacceptable that African Americans are more anti-vax in such larger proportion compared to other ethnic groups. The concerns of these communities should be heard and understood, but the goal should be to build bridges between them and healthcare providers, which is exactly what community leaders in Pittsburgh have done over the last few months with positive results. In my opinion, the strategy to fix this anti-vax problem would be to approach African American communities, talk to them, understanding that their concerns over shady practices in medicine is warranted, but that they are wrong if they think they are the only community affected by this, that white people are not sometimes victims of abuse as well. It's unfortunately a problem that has affected everybody. But these unfortunate cases should not discourage them to trust in vaccines due to one undeniable scientific fact. Vaccines work. And if they care about protecting their communities from COVID, they should take the fucking shot. Vaccines save lives, and the people spreading anti-vax fear in their communities are causing serious harm, no matter the color of their skin. I've been Sarah Michel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.